When did I meet Jon? Do I even know? I'm trying to remember. I think I met Jon, maybe it was just around WRL work, around War Resistance League stuff, but it might have been earlier than that. But I remember Jon just being very open and very genuine and hitting me as somebody that, if this makes sense, that saw himself, that was able to look at himself honestly. And we're all human, so there's a degree to which you can't necessarily do that, but he looked like somebody who'd done a little work on that, And anytime I encounter white people who are working against racism, there are people who'll say it. And what they really mean is they read a Martin Luther King book back in the 60s. I mean, I think part of it is just there are people that you meet that you have a sense that you've probably got a lot of things in common. And, African-American women, I'm meeting a white man, so automatically there's a level of which, just so you don't get slapped upside the head, you learn over time. It sounds terrible, but not to have your hopes up too much, or not to have undue expectations. People come out of where they come out of; they're going to be who they are. But dude's standing there with like tie-dye, and he's hanging with some people you kind of have a lot of respect for, and you're kind of like, well, this is probably a good one here, And it sounds terrible; it sounds really arrogant. But there are issues around trust coming from any oppressed group meeting someone who's with the other group, And that could be if some young person meeting me and doesn't know if I'm.
What was your experience in terms of his positioning himself, and how, how his politics sort of play themselves out? What do you have any?
I mean, I think one thing for me about Jon, his politics, how that sort of worked in his life, is that it wasn't static. He didn't see, okay, I'm a this, and that's the end of that, and I'm not going to look at anything else. And he also, very similar to me, and maybe this is one of the things I sort of connected on, were people who were concerned about a lot of different issues and saw connections between them and didn't see that you can only work on one thing, but also didn't necessarily all the time, at least, try to kill ourselves working on everything. But Jon treated people like human beings. There are people that you can hug, and Jon was one of them. There are people that you can get silly with, and Jon was one of them. There are people that if something about a group that you're working with or an issue you're working on is making you incredibly just bug out, that you can sit there and talk to them. And they're not either going to say, oh man, that's really rough, good luck with that, or this is the answer. Yes, Luke, I have the answer. They're not going to do that. They're going to be like, well, let's just kick it and try to figure it out. And you may not have the answer, at the end of it, or him coming to you, or a group of people talking. You may just all have been like, okay, here's another possible way to think about this. I think we can get to the next day while we're still trying to figure it out. And the tie-dye always comes up. There's something about deciding that you're going to work on some serious, sometimes painful issues. You're talking about war, you're talking about people killing each other. You're talking about a culture where your bravery and your sense of being a strong person is dictated by whether or not you pick up a gun and kill people. That's a lot of stuff to have to work against, to have to fight against. The reason why you do your work to try to change the world, to try to create really radical change in how people interact, see each other, treat each other, have access to resources, has to be based in understanding love and joy. And if you're not modeling that in how you treat each other, if you slide into too far and don't pull yourself back, slide into reflecting the cruelty or reflecting how your spirit's getting beat down, then you're losing it. You're not going to be as effective. You may feel like it, all your books may get written, all your speeches may get made, all your rallies may happen, but the heart's gone out of it. And he just always struck me in his politics as somebody where the heart was still there. There were people that I met who were able to have a political analysis, work in coalition with people who had some differences with them, but enough core goals about how a society would work. And I think of Jon as one of those people because of the work around and concern around political prisoner issues, but also the work around and concern around anti-war and nonviolence things. The other thing that I came to know, just even talking to him when I was at WRL and after that, was that it wasn't just a question of nonviolent violence means stopping war. And for some people that's the only thing they're really thinking about. And sort of, again, the way you treat people, there's violence involved in that. To me, racism is saying, there's Jon, he's cute, he's got tie-dye, yeah. But there was a complexity there and an ability to suss things out, to dig at what's underneath things and figure out all of what might be there. And again, not, ascribing perfection to anyone involved in this discussion, least of all me, but even being open to doing that. And it's one of the things if somebody said, do a free word association thing about Jon that's open, would be one of them. fun would be another, but open would be another one. It's that you have to, it taught me a lot. It reminded me of some things that are really easy to forget when you work on an issue like the death penalty, when you're surrounded by thinking about, war, and because, you meet somebody, when you have eclectic musical tastes, and you meet somebody who shares those, you don't forget that person's phone number. You hang on to that person, because someone there are friends that you meet that are people you consider family, that you consider people that you really could connect with. But again, if you know your family, there are also flaws everywhere, and there are times and I never was in a situation where I had an argument with him or wasn't speaking to him or anything like that, but I do remember times when I would get very, very frustrated, doing political work, and there were certain people you'd think of that you'd talk to, and Jon was definitely one of those, and really thought of him I have a little brother, and so there were certain folks you think of that are people you can talk, and some of the friends that I had, frankly, who were on death row, including one of them who ended up being executed. And then I remember, talking to Jon about stuff and being able to kick it about that kind of stuff and get some little insights, So, and I was always, I have to say, also astonished because I knew about his work around violence against women. And it just seemed to make so much sense to have men working on that stuff. It just seemed like, why doesn't everybody see this? What's wrong with you people? Of course, it's kind of like, anti-racism. Okay, well, the people of color, we're going to be working on that so we're not getting beat up all the time, but y'all are the ones who got to work on it. It just seems so absolutely, instinctive, intuitive. But it's a big, new notion for a lot of people. So I automatically had respect for him because he was even taking that work on. Because it's a very, very hard thing to do.
Did you have any?
But I think the people you do care about, if you think you can, those are the ones that you engage with to try to make change happen. And so it was really clear to me, however much people might have felt like, oh, why is he always beating up on us? Or why are we still talking about this? I marched with Martin, why are we still talking about this? Or those aren't issues we have to deal with. Look, we have 2.5 staff people who are people of color. Whatever, things people raise which have some validity to them, but ultimately are acting as a defense mechanism. Whatever that stuff was, the reality is that he did it, out of a place of, I love this organization, I love these people, there's a lot of work that we need to be doing and we still have the potential to do it. And we need to try to address this particular problem because our work is too important to keep doing it with this still staring us in the face, And it's I just have so much respect for the fact that he did that. Because for me, I'm really saying I'm somebody who works on racism. I really can't totally abdicate my responsibility like that. I really do have to raise it. But you decide who you're going to raise it with. And knowing that with people like Jon, that you could, Jon, I'm fried, I can't deal with this. But let me just tell you this thing, and if you can feed that into the work you're doing, This thing about allies, about having people who are allies in struggle, it doesn't mean that you're clones of each other. It doesn't mean that you are always, in every little thing, going to be trooping off to all the same activities. It definitely doesn't mean you come out of the same experience. But to me, it also, when I use the word, doesn't mean it's conditional. Like we had these situational allies for this one struggle, and then after that we're going to go back to our own corners and never talk to each other again. There's a thing when you're allies and you're friends, when that connects and that joins, where you do have these friends that you're like, how on earth did I ever end up being friends with this person? How'd that happen? People were out there with drums and sound shakers and sound makers. And to me, that was just really, there's other music that Jon listened to that I might have heard of or heard or never went to that concert, but the spirit of that kind of music and the spirit of that kind of communication and the spirit of that kind of bringing so many different kinds of people together, really, to me, that's what Jon was about. Yeah. Jon, and there were people that the minute you meet them, this is somebody you're going to remember, and they're going to stay in your life, and they're just going to be there. But the story that I remember, I can't even remember if Jon was home. Jon might have been in the hospital, and I was in the hospital, and I woke up after my surgery, and the phone rang, and it was Jon checking on me, and he had this voice. Jon had the greatest voice, and this deep voice. And I picked the phone up, and hello, and I was just like, oh, honey, thank you. You called to see if I was okay. I hate hospitals. I'm totally freaked out. I don't remember what we talked about, but just the fact that he did that, and I just never forget it. I felt so scared, alone, and it was the kind of thing where I felt like I shouldn't talk about it because we have other ways of supporting you. But there's something about the fact that it was him, that it was a man, that it was Jon who was dealing with his own very painful health issues. It just meant more to me than any other phone call I could have gotten. I will never forget it. No, I get verklempt. Think about Jon's sort of successive waves of fighting his own illness. And that, somebody was talking about this, that toy they used to have, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. It's like, yeah, we'll fall down, but we hop back up again, And he just kept coming back up again. And it was really sort of a model for me, to keep trying to do it, but not just to keep trying to do it because I was being tough, but to keep trying to do it because I didn't want the strength and sort of the shell that I had to protect myself in to like get up and fight my way through the pain and get to work every day to make me so hard that I forgot why I love to do it. And it's a real to remember part of Jon's spirits. Like I kind of like knew, that he was struggling with stuff, and there were times when you couldn't necessarily even see it. You sort of were like, he's a little too thin. And then there's when you really could see it. There were times when it was very obvious. But he neither walked around like, oh, it's me, I'm sick, feel bad for me. Nor did he walk around like, I'm the poster child for surviving illness. Nor did he walk around, I'm not sick. I mean, it was there. It's in movies. Whatever you can do it. So you feel alive, And I remember someone telling a story about like rock climbing or something, or hiking with Jon, and they're just like, how on earth is he doing this? And he wasn't doing Everest, and he wasn't trying to do it faster than anyone else, but what he could do, he was going to do.
It was Mario.
It was
Vieques.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I just remember that when he said it.
Yeah.
Because he, I guess.
And I think a lot of times, as with sort of pioneers and prophets.
Think of Jon or describe
him. I think in a free association, I would just sort of call him a bright star. He was such an unusual person, and when I first met him, that was my feeling of him, that I, just catching his eyes across a room and thinking, who is this person? And he was just radiating something very different from other people in the room. So that's something about him that was very just unique, completely unique, and not a person that was pompous or grandiose or arrogant about that uniqueness. He just carried it with him, like a little personal torch or light or something that radiated goodness in the world. And so, Jon did not ever like the use of the word field of Batter's intervention, and he said we were turning movements into fields. And that it was those kind of conversations that propelled me to want to maintain contact and dialogue with him, because he challenged my mind, and he challenged my thinking.
Yeah, I think Jon really saw connections between issues in a way that I really agree with as well, and that was one of the things that I appreciated about him, that he didn't necessarily have a hierarchy of oppressions. He saw that they were connected, and he was able to articulate those in a way that I think was very persuasive to most people.
As a white person, to people of color.
Well, I think he really kind of proved it to me in the program he ended up working with Phyllis, where, as I said, any woman from the community could come in and see what they were doing, give them feedback, and keep an eye on them. So I thought that was amazingly impressive. And I think he also showed that, in his work, where I saw him most was at War Sisters League, but I think he did it in other groups too. But, he really would, with women, he really brought up those issues and backed up women a lot, and asked for input, and checked out what women were thinking, and also with the few people of color that were on staff. And there he really, I think, sort of put his beliefs into action there and tried to be a really good ally. Yeah. I think he was an unusually connected and connecting person, and so generous, and connecting other people together, and
And the fact also that we had a definition of war that was much broader, not only than conscientious objection, but militarism per se, because we included things like male violence, white supremacy, things like that as a definition of war, class war, for example. We had a much broader political agenda than, we were very passionate about trying to prevent war and trying to encourage people not to serve in the military and give resources to people to do local organizing around the country and so forth. But much of the leadership of WRL in the mid-'80s shared a couple of things. Number one, they were very much old guard. They were primarily folks who had the experience of being conscientious objectors in World War II, and some people who'd come in during the Vietnam era, but a lot of folks who'd been in the organization for 30, 40 years. The fact that neither John nor I lived in New York and that we were both pretty young, and the fact also that we had a definition of war that was much broader, not only than conscientious objection, but militarism per se, because we included things like male violence, white supremacy, things like that as a definition of war, class war, for example. We had a much broader political agenda than, we were very passionate about trying to prevent war and trying to encourage people not to serve in the military and give resources to people to do local organizing around the country and so forth. But we also wanted to expand the definition of war to include all forms of violence against people that are systemic and organized by institutions, primarily institutions of the state. Things in common also. We were both sort of long-haired freaks. We both had a passion for music. Of course, he was incredibly passionate about the Grateful Dead, which I despised. And so he began his process over the next couple of decades of trying to convert me to being a fan of the Grateful Dead. He never succeeded, but we had a number of other musical tastes in common because, I listened to pretty much everything, and so did he, and so we would exchange tapes of music. And, really nice to know that John was out there in the world doing his thing, because, he was very clear, even at that age, about his politics, about his personal politics, how he took his ideals and transformed them into how he lived his daily life. He was very conscientious about all of that and always challenging himself to try and, incorporate what he believed should be a better world into how he lived his own life. I just tremendously admired him. I admired his commitment to organizing. I admired his politics. I admired him on a personal level, and he was a good friend. Even when I met him in his early 20s, he was involved in Raven in St. Louis, which is a men's collective working to end male violence and provide support for victims of male violence as well. And I think he was always challenged about trying to take that ethic of being responsible as a man to what men do and the privilege that men have in a patriarchal society. I think over time he became more aware of the similarities of that with racial politics and white supremacism and white skin privilege, and trying to work through that. And he was, at the time I met him, this was the height of, those years were the height of U.S. support for the various dictatorships and death squad regimes and covert wars in Central America. And I think he was conflicted even then, but became even more so over the years around and trying to work through the politics of being a pacifist, being opposed to all war, but still trying to find a way to be supportive of people in liberation struggles who are using armed resistance as a means of struggle. That was something that those of us who were young working within WRL also had in common, because we were dealing with World War II era COs for whom their political growth or their initial political formation of political ideologies came even before the anti-colonialist movement of the 50s and 60s. So they were very much rooted in a view of militarism and in a view of how you confront oppressive regimes that didn't take race, didn't take class, didn't take the global politics of the Cold War into account from the perspective of the global South. And that was all things that we were trying to wrestle with. So I think it was something that over the years, and particularly after he moved to New York City and got involved with some of the anti-racism groups there, of course that's a much more ethnically diverse place than St. Louis, I think there was a lot of growth there in terms of the alliances he made with people in different struggles, his ability to both hold pacifist principles and do political organizing and activism in support of people who didn't necessarily share those ideals, but who were still working toward the same kind of world that he was. Because he was taking his leadership, I think, on a lot of those issues from people of color, from people involved in liberation struggles, and that's the way to do it. You know, you don't sit on your high horse and, you know, make a determination of what I, as a privileged white person, am willing to do to help people. You go to them and you ask, what can I do? What will be helpful? What can I learn? And Jon very much did that, and that's the way to go about it. He was also much more forgiving than I was about another political arena that we shared, which was pro-feminism. And he started a publication called Activist Men's Journal in 1987, and after he passed that on, I wound up being one of the co-editors for several years. And that started as sort of a caucus within a group called National Organization of Men Against Sexism. Actually, when it started, it was National Organization of Changing Men. One time he challenged me to, you know, have more compassion and be more willing to listen to people within the organization who had different perspectives. The pro-feminist men's movement basically came out of, obviously, the feminist movement of the late 60s and early 70s. The way I experienced it, and I think the way a lot of it developed, it was the consciousness-raising movement, where you had first a movement of women doing consciousness-raising workshops, and then men started taking consciousness-raising workshops as well about how to relate to women, how to relate to the feminist movement. And around, I think it was in the early 80s that, it might have even been the late 70s, but that the National Organization of Changing Men came together. I don't remember the exact date, but there was a lot of energy behind it. It tended, I think, to be not so much allied with radical feminism as allied with sort of the more mainstream groups, and very much focused on, or at least the men involved in it seemed to be very much more focused on personal growth and personal relationships than institutional sexism, public policy, large-scale political change. And something that Jon and I had in common is that we were interested in both. We were interested both in doing work, you know, one-on-one with victims of domestic violence and perpetrators as well. And we were interested in the larger political questions and how to strategize around that and how to create change. At first, the men's movement was very broad. It was, you know, any men who cared about gender issues. For instance, the men's rights movement was originally part of NOCM, of National Organization of Changing Men. So was what would become the mythopoetic movement and Robert Bly and those folks, you know, that was more spiritually based. All of those split off from this original movement as it evolved, as people's politics became clearer, and as you began to see divisions between people who cared about the politics of feminism, people who cared about personal growth, people who cared about men asserting their rights in terms of gender identity, you know, around issues like alimony, where they felt, the child custody, where they felt they were being unfairly treated or targeted. And there were some tremendous splits around that, of course, and a lot of that happened really before I began to be exposed to the organizing on a national level. And when I did, it was through Jon. And so I think over the years, there was always this evolution within the pro-feminist men's movement to keep trying to further politicize it. And it went up and down. You know, one year in the early 90s, I think it was 90 or 91, Jon and Jack Straighton became co-chairs of No Mas. And they launched this very ambitious program to try and do a couple of different political organizing campaigns. And they got virtually no support for it from other people in leadership positions in the organization. And I know he was very upset and very disappointed around that. But the movement itself, you know, I don't think on a local level was very successful in some initiatives, things like Raven in St. Louis. But on a national level, you know, I don't know that it had nearly the impact that, and has had nearly the impact that it should have. And then the Activist Men's Journal was essentially, and this of course is, you know, before email, before, you know, any of these things, and just really at the beginning of the cusp of the whole zine movement. And what it was, people in the Activist Men's Caucus would send Jon photocopies of descriptions of the local organizing that they were doing. And every couple of months, Jon would just collate it and send it out to everyone on the list. He didn't edit it, just took whatever he got, compiled it, and sent it back out. So it was a means of communication of what was going on in different local areas. And it became larger than the Men's Caucus because it started to include people like me who had no real affiliation with No Mas at all, but who were doing work in local areas on, you know, anti-rape work or, you know, solidarity with rape crisis centers and domestic violence and, you know, things like that. You know, Take Back the Night was still a fairly large movement at that point, and some people were involved with those sorts of organizing things. Well, that was, draft resistance was one of the things we had in common. Draft registration was reintroduced in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And of course, now we know that that was partially in response to a CIA initiative that we sort of sucked them into Afghanistan. That was one of the things the Carter administration did. You know, Jimmy Carter was much less of a humanitarian in foreign policy than people seem to remember today. And one of the things he did to send a message to the Soviets was reinstitute draft registration, which has always been, since its inception, draft registration has always been completely useless from a military standpoint. What it served to do was normalize the idea of militarism for 18-year-old men and to get them thinking in terms of the military. You know, it's a step toward not just reinstituting a draft if that becomes, you know, politically feasible at some point, but also just in general to incorporating military as part of how we think about our society, as a thing that's necessary, that's a thing that's a good public service, and not just any military service, but of course the specific ways in which the U.S. uses its military, which you know, conservatives tend to point toward World War II and the good war, but the unspoken flip side of that is that virtually every U.S. military intervention since then, I think pretty much all of them, have been bad wars. And it's not just Vietnam. There have been dozens of bombings and covert and overt invasions and coups and coup attempts and, you know, all of the different things that the United States does in its foreign policy. To us, all of that was represented and was being normalized by draft registration. And I was in the original age that was asked to register when this was instituted. And so I was one of about 200 people around the country who publicly refused to do it. So draft registration was not just an issue in itself, it was also an entree to talk about militarism in general. And not just militarism in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but militarism in terms of how we think about it as the fabric of American culture and society. And the way we normalize it. And this is something Jon and I were both very interested in, and spent a lot of time within WRL working on as well. And you know, he worked on it a lot over the years.